There they go. Now it's up to Robert. Roland stood in a somewhat secluded spot in the arena stands. The other spectators, consisting of lesser nobles, merchants, and their guards, had spread out in both directions to avoid him. It was an odd sight, watching these people fear him, but at least it gave him some peace. His gaze settled on his sister, who was clutching her hands near her heart, and his stepmother, mirroring the same anxious gesture. The time for the duel had arrived, and now there was nothing Roland could do to help his brother. If he tried anything, the mages would instantly notice the shift in his mana and likely call off the duel in Graham's favor. Name: Gerhard L. 156. Classes: T3 Spirit Master Sword Knight L6. T2 Spirit Sword Knight L50. T2 Sword Knight L50. T1 Squire L25. T1 Warrior L25. Eventually, his eyes turned to Gerhard and his status, something Roland was already familiar with. His class was a mouthful, but it wasn't particularly impressive, though not terrible either. This man was likely similar to Emerson, the first knight commander he fought, but at a much lower level. However, Gerhard's abilities had been artificially boosted by the red crystals, a fact Roland wished he could bring up. As if anyone would believe me at this point. There were side effects to using those blood gems to enhance one's skills, but with enough money, it was possible to minimize or even eliminate them. People who took them tended to become more irritable and violent, which was hardly enough for a formal accusation. The debuff caused by the crystals would eventually disappear, leaving no trace, though it often left lasting effects on the person's mind. He has no last name. Graham probably chose him as an expendable pawn. Even if Gerhard were caught, Graham could just claim he acted on his own and that it was Leopold who gave him the crystals. Finally, Roland's gaze shifted to Robert, who was clad in his latest creation, the Rune Power Armor prototype. The Rune Power Armor prototype that Robert wore was not only a testament to Roland's craftsmanship but also to Arian's ingenuity. The height of the user was close to 2 meters, and with the addition of the armor that put Robert at 2 meters 20. Each section of the armor was seamlessly interlocked, giving him the appearance of an imposing iron sentinel. The armor's core structure was crafted from dwarven steel, renowned for its durability and compatibility with enchantments. Its matte black finish absorbed light rather than reflecting it, giving it an eerie, foreboding presence in the arena. Many mistook Robert for a dark knight or even an iron golem monster at first glance. The most striking feature was the chest piece, with angular ridges and an embossed rune circle at its center, faintly glowing with pale blue magical energy. The shoulders were rounded yet bulky, designed to protect the joints beneath, while the legs were similarly reinforced for maximum defense. However, the true weak point of the design lay in the backpack housing several large runic batteries. These cylindrical batteries were welded shut to prevent them from dislodging during combat, which limited the suit's operational time but provided an additional layer of protection. All of this was tied together with a simple but crucial design philosophy: protection and power without sacrificing mobility. Roland had designed the armor to be the ultimate balance of strength and speed, taking into account Robert's natural fighting style. As an addition, his brother was handed the large mithril sword he had received from Emerson, along with the black mithril tower shield he had retrieved from the Albrook dungeon. Armed with these two bulky weapons, Robert would have to defeat his opponent, who was protected by his own set of enchanted mithril armor. Good, he came equipped with that armor and the weapons, everything is going according to plan, now just Robert needs to do it. A dome of transparent blue energy enveloped the entire arena. Mages stationed at the four corners maintained the barrier, continuously supplying it with their mana. Even a Tier 3 attack wouldn't be able to penetrate it. Roland could feel the weight of eyes on him as nearly all of Graham's men were watching, Leopold included. The time for the duel had finally arrived, and now everyone was waiting for the Count to give the signal. Count Graham's hand hovered in the air as the anticipation in the arena reached its peak. Every noble, merchant, and knight in attendance held their breath, eyes trained on the two figures standing at the center of the magical dome. On one side, Sir Gerhard, the seasoned knight and champion of House de Vere, stood poised, his gleaming sword raised in a display of strength. On the other, Robert Arden, his towering figure encased in the experimental runic power armor, remained still as if waiting for the right moment to strike. So this is it. I can do this, no, I shall. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the signal. His life flashed through his mind once more as he locked eyes with the man he was destined to face, a Tier 3 class holder, the very tier he aspired to reach. Though he had made rapid progress on the battlefield, this opponent was far superior in power, strength, and experience. Without the buffing spells his brother had cast on him, his knees would likely be trembling at this very moment. Finally, with a sharp flick of his wrist, Count Graham signaled the start of the match. His voice, amplified by his personal mage, boomed through the arena. Let the duel begin. Sir Gerhard moved first, his body a blur of motion. Despite the weight of his mithril armor, he charged forward with the grace and speed of a well-trained warrior. His sword imbued with runic enchantments, crackled with lightning elemental power as he brought it down in a vicious arc aimed directly at Robert's head. For a moment, Robert froze as the man charged at him, clearly intent on ending the fight sooner rather than later. It wasn't the sudden movement that made him hesitate, but rather the flashing red display in front of his eyes, warning him just before the man truly made his move. Without this magical contraption, Robert would have undoubtedly been decapitated on the spot. But as the attack was about to connect, he forced his body into a defensive stance, raising his massive shield just in time to absorb the blow. This ingenious device had been something Robert was still trying to get used to after only a few days of practice. Roland called it a graphical interface, though the term meant little to him. One side of the display showed a miniature version of his power armor, while a strange white aura would form around his opponent before the battle began. As soon as his enemy moved, the parts of their body used for the attack would flash red, along with the corresponding part of Robert's armor, indicating where the blow would land. Even with this system in place, his reaction time was limited. A Tier 3 knight's speed was at least twice his own. On top of that, feints were always a problem. The runic machine could detect the true strike, but it left him with an even smaller window to react. He had practiced with his brother playing the role of his opponent, but even now, he hadn't fully mastered this strange system. The arena erupted in shock as Robert narrowly blocked Sir Gerhard's lightning-fast strike with his massive black mithril tower shield. The crackling energy from Gerhard's sword collided violently with Robert's defenses, sending sparks flying. The force of the blow was immense, and the lightning energy traveled through the eternity of his frame. The display informed him about the amount of damage he took, but it was quite minimal. To everyone's surprise, the massive suit of armor absorbed the powerful strike from the Tier 3 knight without buckling. It stood firmly rooted to the ground, as if the blow was nothing. But Gerhard didn't relent. He unleashed a relentless barrage of strikes, each one faster and more forceful than the last, powered by his enchanted armor. Robert found himself on the defensive, retreating while using his enormous tower shield to protect himself. The sword Gerhard wielded was sharp, but ill-suited for cutting through the thick, heavily armored frame of Robert's power armor. Even when Robert couldn't raise his shield in time, the strikes left only minor nicks and scratches on the dense dwarven metal, which was built to withstand much worse. Impressive, boy, but how long can you hold up against me, if the only thing you can do is defend yourself? Sooner or later your armor will break. The man's eyes, visible through his helmet, flashed red as he continued his relentless assault. Each strike was accompanied by a burst of crackling lightning energy. To the crowd, it looked like a one-sided confrontation, with Robert's massive suit of armor seemingly offering little resistance. It appeared as though the fight would soon be over. However, a plan was quietly unfolding. Robert had been well informed about his opponent, as well as the equipment he was using. He wasn't up against a true magic swordsman, but rather someone whose mana pool couldn't keep up with the flashy, enchanted gear they wore. He had 20 charges and he isn't using them sparingly, just like Roland said, this Gerhard likes to be flashy. He wasn't sure where his brother got the information, but the man before him was an open book. Roland presented him with his opponent's personality traits along with what weapons he would be using before the bout even started. Now, after the fight had been going for a few minutes, it was finally time for a counterattack. The time for conserving power was no more, and he would finally show everyone that he was not here to die by this man's hand. The sword slashed against his tower shield again, followed by a flurry of blows, one even connecting with the side of Robert's helmet. But the interface inside his visor alerted him to where the next strike would land. This time, he was ready. It was finally time for a true exchange of blows. Though his swordsmanship was inferior to his opponent's, the marvel of his armor made up for his shortcomings. As the enemy's strike nicked his joint, trying to exploit a weak point, Robert's own massive mithril blade came down on the opponent's teardrop-shaped shield. The impact sent the man flying to the side and the crowd gasped in surprise. What power! Can a Tier 2 knight really be capable of that? While Robert's power armor sustained minor damage, it was worth it. The sheer force he could generate in this prototype was astonishing, clearly surpassing what his opponent could muster. The added weight and power of his equipment made it impossible for the smaller shield to absorb the blow without serious consequences. Sir Gerhard's body skidded across the arena floor, his shield slightly warped from the impact. He scrambled to his feet, shocked by the massive blow he just received. His left arm felt numb and he was off balance. He gritted his teeth together and glanced back at his opponent who was charging forward at a speed previously not shown. The armor's legs moving at long strides to bridge the distance in just a few movements. "You just got lucky," the man shouted while charging back into the fray. In his mind, backing off would be disgracing both his name and the Lord's. Robert watched as Sir Gerhard recovered quickly, charging back with fury in his eyes. He could feel the weight of the crowd's expectations, their eyes glued to the unfolding duel. The man before him, despite his overconfidence, was no ordinary opponent. But Robert was no longer the hesitant, uncertain young man he had been before this duel. The brief success of his counterattack had sparked something inside him, a realization of his own strength and the incredible potential of the power armor he now commanded. Gerhard rushed forward again, sword raised high, but Robert was prepared. The graphical interface in his visor flashed red, warning him of the exact angle of the attack. With a swift movement, he brought up his massive tower shield, the enchanted mithril edge catching the blow with a loud clang. The sound echoed through the arena, but this time, Robert didn't just defend. As Gerhard's blade met his shield, Robert pivoted, using the momentum to swing his enormous sword in a wide arc. Gerhard barely managed to leap back, his sword deflecting the blow at the last second. The force of Robert's strike sent a shockwave through the air, kicking up a cloud of dust. The crowd gasped as they witnessed the raw power behind Robert's attack. "You're better than I thought. But you only delay the inevitable," Gerhard growled, circling Robert like a predator stalking its prey. He realized that while his opponent might have the advantage in strength and power, he was superior in speed. Another exchange of blows followed, but to the knight's surprise, even with his agility, he couldn't land a meaningful strike. Each time one of his precise attacks was about to connect, Robert would either deflect it or force him back with the swing of his massive sword. It felt as if Robert could anticipate his every move, reacting with uncanny precision before Gerhard even made up his mind about his next strike. The Azure Lion Knights Order must have exaggerated about the strength of their knights, if this is all you can muster. Robert had finally found a good rhythm and even felt confident enough to mock his opponent, an action that the knight did not appreciate. Sir Gerhard's face flushed with anger beneath his helm, his strikes growing wilder as his frustration mounted. The seemingly impenetrable defense of Robert's armor, combined with the unexpected strength of his counterattacks, was starting to wear on the seasoned knight. The crowd's reactions were a mixture of awe and disbelief, and the rage on Count Graham's face was starting to show. "You fool, what are you doing? Get this duel over with this instant!" the man shouted out from his balcony while slamming his hand down onto the large chair that he was sitting on. The other knights and nobility flinched at Count Graham's outburst but remained silent. "You dare mock me and my order!" Gerhard roared, his voice echoing through the barrier. His sword rained down, now encased in spirit energy rather than lightning, as the charges on his blade had already been depleted. Eventually, he retreated a few steps, cast aside his shield, and drew a large enchanted mithril mace from his left side. "Even that shield will crack under this." With renewed vigor and a weapon imbued with magical charges, he rushed in again. The runes on the mace began to glow bright orange, and he could feel the weight and power of his strike intensifying. He was certain that when it collided with the shield, the enchantment would tear it from his opponent's metallic grasp. However, just before the mace made contact, he heard Robert say something in a hushed tone, words that would alter the course of the confrontation. "Activate the enchantment inhibitor." The moment his mace collided with the shield, an explosion of magical energies was expected. The runic enchantment on the mace was an advanced version of impact and explosive runes, designed to be highly effective against opponents encased in thick metal. However, for some reason, the rune's intensity diminished, and instead of a powerful explosion, only a minor one occurred. To make matters worse, his opponent had anticipated this outcome with perfect precision. The massive shield parried the blow, sending Gerhard's hand that was still gripping the mace, reeling back. To make things worse, the defensive runes on his mithril armor were also going pale. They were made to react whenever he was struck by heavier blows, but now it seemed like they weren't working. "Ha!" Robert shouted as he swung his blade at the off-balance Gerhard. Seeing the incoming attack, Gerhard contorted his body to evade the strike and used both his weapons to defend himself. It was still possible for him to block the attack if he could accurately predict the blade's path. "Too simple!" Gerhard shouted back, raising his defenses at what he believed to be the right moment. However, just before his defense could fully engage, a few runes on Robert's blade began to glow. They emitted a sharp, resonant clang before propelling the blade forward with increased speed. The enhanced strike collided forcefully with Gerhard's chest plate, sending the man flying while the audience silently watched at something that should not have been possible. "Did you see that? What happened?" "I don't know. Did his enchantment malfunction or did he not activate it correctly?" A few merchants murmured among themselves as they saw Gerhard flung to the side. His chest plate had been dented by a strike from a large sword, but the mithril armor held firm. The onlookers noticed his confidence when attacking. His swing was wide and forceful, leaving him open for his opponent's devastating blow. Although the armor remained intact, the impact sent him rolling for tens of meters, ending with a collision against the arena wall. The audience erupted in a mix of murmurs and gasps, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The other knights, seated in the stands, exchanged uneasy glances. It was becoming clear that this duel was not following the rules of conventional combat, at least not for Sir Gerhard. Up in the stands, Count Graham's face twisted with a mix of rage and disbelief. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of his chair, eyes burning holes into the two combatants. The plan had been for Gerhard to win decisively and no one had expected Robert, a mere Tier 2 knight in a strange new armor, to stand a chance against a seasoned Tier 3 warrior like Gerhard. But the tide of the battle had shifted, and one person in the audience knew why. Roland allowed himself a small smile, though it went unnoticed due to his helmet. Everything was unfolding just as he had calculated. The rune system he had designed wasn't just for protection and power, it included specialized enchantments like the rune inhibitor, which could disrupt or nullify certain magical energies within a set range. Gerhard had unwittingly walked right into his trap. His skill at dispelling enemy enchantments was quite extensive, but creating a device to mimic it wasn't easy. There were limitations, and only thanks to his thorough espionage before the arena fight was he able to succeed. Roland knew exactly what type of armor Robert's opponent would be wearing and the magics it relied on. The combatants from the other side were restricted from using overly powerful magical equipment, a fact Roland cleverly exploited. It was one thing to develop a smart system that could target enchantments during combat, but quite another if he knew in advance what to target. Gerhard possessed a full set of mithril armor with only basic shielding enchantments. His weapons were similar, his sword carried a limited lightning discharge spell that wasn't quite of the highest tier, and his mace had an enhanced impact rune that was more of a pseudo-tier 3 enchantment. Roland had advised Robert to defend himself during the first half of the duel, frustrating his opponent with his defensive stance. Then, once his foe grew reckless, he would activate the enchantment inhibition system and use the confusion to launch a counterattack. "Get up!" Count Graham's voice erupted from his seat on the balcony, his facade beginning to show cracks. The calm and composed demeanor he was known for was crumbling before his peers. The mask of nobility and refinement was quickly slipping away as his champion, Sir Gerhard, struggled to recover from the shocking turn of events. Gerhard, on the other hand, was still reeling. His pride, as much as his body, had taken a severe blow. Slowly, he pulled himself to his feet, clutching his dented chest plate. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes darted between Robert and the arena wall he'd collided with moments before. For the first time since the duel began, doubt crept into his mind. His enchanted mace, the tool he thought would easily break through Robert's defenses, had been rendered useless. Worse, the crowd's murmurs and the look of confusion in his fellow knight's eyes sent a wave of humiliation through him. His opponent was already charging toward him, and after taking the hit, he had lost his grip on one of his weapons. Now, he was left with only the mace, which had failed to activate its impact rune. However, for some reason, the enchantment on it was quickly springing back to life, offering a glimmer of hope that it might work if he tried again. His grip tightened around the handle, the enchanted glow flickering back into existence. "You think this is over, boy?" Gerhard growled through clenched teeth, his voice dripping with venom. "I've faced better warriors than you and never lost. I will not be defeated by a whelp." Robert didn't respond, instead he focused on the graphical display that continued feeding him data about Gerhard's movements. His confidence was solidifying, and he began to believe he could win against someone of a higher tier. His trust in his brother had been strong from the start, but even he hadn't anticipated his brother's genius. The tide of battle was turning in his favor, and he needed to seize the moment that had presented itself. "This whelp is already grown." Roland watched the exchange between the two with bated breath. While the plan had worked and his brother was now able to attack, the battle had not been won. He had already managed to analyze Gerhard's capabilities, and the power armor only leveled the playing field. The two were about equal to each other, and the enchantment inhibitor couldn't be used too much as it would drain the armor's batteries. However, his brother wasn't only his armor, he was a man that had honed his skills in battles against other nations, while the man he was facing was more of a career knight. The noble blade class Robert was using focused on two-handed swordplay. Although his skills were lacking compared to the Tier 3 knight, momentum was on his side. Roland watched as his brother discarded his tower shield and gripped the large blade, its hilt extending to accommodate his now larger hands as he lunged forward. His steps sounded mechanical, the ground sinking slightly under the weight of his power armor. Finally, the two collided in a furious exchange of blows. Gerhard's mace came crashing down, its enchantment glowing brightly once again, but Robert was prepared. With the heavy, two-handed mithril sword in his grip, he met the attack head-on. The impact shook the ground, sending a reverberating clang throughout the arena. Robert's armor held firm, absorbing the brunt of the strike, but the sheer force of Gerhard's blow caused sparks to fly from the contact point. "You're nothing without that armor." Gerhard spat, his voice desperate now as the audience watched in stunned silence. His confidence had waned, but his fury had not. He lashed out again, his strikes fast and brutal, but Robert's system continued feeding him crucial data, helping him predict and deflect the attacks with his massive sword. Eventually, allowing him to get used to his opponent's form, parry and land blows of his own. The blade he held was imbued with several enchantments, all specifically designed to counter his opponent. Even when the enchanted mace regained its magical power, the magic could be absorbed by the runic enhancements on the sword. Within his display, Robert could choose between several modes: offensive, defensive, and all-rounder. By focusing his gaze on a particular part of the display, he could switch modes after a brief moment. Once the blade was set to offensive mode, its attacks became lighter and more powerful as they neared their target. Robert grunted as Gerhard's mace met his blade with a violent clang, but instead of flinching, he pushed back with all his might. His power armor's joints whined in protest, but the runic power armor did its work, boosting his strength far beyond what Gerhard could have anticipated. For a brief moment, their weapons locked, the clashing energies between them sending ripples of mana through the arena's air. "You think this armor is all I have?" Gerhard sneered at the comment. To him he was fighting against the magical contraption and not really the man inside, who was nothing more than an inexperienced fighter. Even now he was not taking him seriously, and that would be his downfall. He tried twisting his mace in an attempt to get free, but his opponent was faster. Using the momentum from the clash, he twisted his body and pulled his blade away, forcing Gerhard to stumble forward slightly. With a quick pivot, Robert struck. His mithril sword moved with shocking speed for something so large and heavy, arcing through the air and slamming against Gerhard's exposed side once more. The sound of metal hitting metal echoed once again, but this time Gerhard couldn't hide the grunt of pain. His armor had already been damaged, and now the enchantment was also no more. He felt a metallic taste in his mouth as blood started to spill out from within his helmet. The audience watched in awe as the once cocky knight staggered backward, his mace dipping low. The enchanted armor's runes started dimming as the traces between them had been cut. From his seat, Count Graham's expression shifted from barely controlled fury to outright panic. He could see it now that Gerhard was losing. His carefully prepared plan of whining quickly and showing off was unraveling before his eyes. What is he doing? He can't lose to him. Not here, not now. Roland was pleased to see Graham panicking, but it was too soon to celebrate. The battle had been raging for quite some time, and the operational time of his power armor was starting to dwindle. The more runic enchantments Robert activated, the faster he would find himself unable to move. Once the power ran out, his armor would become nothing more than a heavy, immobile target. He worried about his brother, who was still inexperienced and might lose himself in the heat of the confrontation without realizing the danger. Fortunately, Roland had prepared for such a moment. Suddenly, a sharp beeping noise echoed inside Robert's helmet, snapping him back to reality. Warning, power reserves below 30%. The sharp beeping reverberated through Robert's helmet, jolting him from the rush of adrenaline and confidence that had been building. His breaths were heavy, his heart pounding in his chest, but the warning message was impossible to ignore. 30%. It wasn't as bad as he feared, but it was a reminder that the clock was ticking. His armor wouldn't last forever, and Gerhard was far from finished. Gerhard, visibly shaken but not yet defeated. He raised his visor that uncovered his face and spat out a glob of blood onto the ground. His stance wavered slightly, but the fury in his eyes had not dimmed. The knight was driven by pride, and with Count Graham's wrathful gaze boring down on him from the balcony, retreat wasn't an option. He threw the mace he was holding to the side as unbeknownst to Robert, he also had a plan. After the exchange of blows, the two ended up close to where he lost his sword, the main weapon he liked to use. The man was a spirit master sword knight and could only display his full power when wielding a sword. Part of Roland's plan had been to disarm Gerhard, preventing him from using his most potent skills. But now Gerhard had regained his main weapon. He raised the sword into the air, and it became enveloped in a pulsating orange aura, expanding its size. The size of the spirit blade reflected the wielder's skill level, and its immense magnitude was likely due to the blood crystal doping. As Gerhard's sword expanded with the pulsating orange aura, the crowd fell into a stunned silence. His spirit blade now towered over him, glowing with a fierce intensity that left no doubt about the raw power it contained. Even Robert, with his superior armor and cutting-edge enchantments, felt a hint of apprehension as he watched the weapon's spirit aura ripple through the air. He had been told about Gerhard's spirit master abilities, but seeing it in person was another matter entirely. "Are you man enough to face me, whelp?" The knight pointed the glowing blade forward, as if issuing a challenge. It was clear he intended to finish the duel with this final move. The skill he was using was a lesser version of the aura blade, but it was still likely powerful enough to cut through Robert's power armor. This was clearly a provocation, meant to pressure Robert into a quick response, as Gerhard didn't have enough mana or stamina to sustain the skill for long. While the blood crystals could raise the skill by a few levels, they couldn't boost the man's base stats. "Of course, are you?" "Humph. You will regret that." Robert responded almost instantly, which came as no surprise to Gerhard. In his eyes, the boy he faced was still immature and easy to provoke, just like the other knights under his command. But Gerhard, a knight commander, was different from them. He knew that if he continued to fight conventionally, he would surely lose. However, if he could land just one hit with his spirit blade, victory would be his. In a direct confrontation, he was confident in the destructive power of his attacks. The two took their stances, Robert holding his large mithril sword which was now dwarfed by the immense aura blade Gerhard was holding. The crowd, the nobles and even the workers, held their breath, waiting to see how this climactic moment would unfold. Robert's breathing steadied as he inched his metallic foot forward and watched his opponent do the same. His gaze glanced to one of the flashing icons on his display as he got ready to unleash his last trump card. Both men exploded into a charge. Gerhard roared, the immense spirit blade swinging downward in a fiery arc, intending to cleave Robert and his armor in two. The knight moved with everything he had, throwing the last of his strength into this single, decisive blow. It was fast, faster than Robert expected, but his visor flashed, marking the trajectory with a red outline. At the last second, right before the clash could commence, a blinding light erupted from Robert's chest. The runes glowed with an intensity rarely seen, enveloping the entire arena in a flash of white light. The audience screamed as their vision was temporarily taken from them. Everyone, except for one person in the stands, was caught off guard by the sudden burst of light, one of the planned strategies all along. Two grunts and a scream echoed from within the blinding light as the confrontation continued. Roland, who had known to shield his eyes, watched the exchange unfold. Blinded by the light, Gerhard flinched and momentarily lost track of his opponent, who remained focused amidst the chaos. The spell was designed to blind everyone in the vicinity, but Robert, having prepared, was unaffected. All he had to do was follow the indicators on the screen to land the last devastating hit. Soon the light dispersed and everyone gasped as the scene before them came into focus. The dust had settled, and the arena lay still. At the center of it, Robert stood tall, his power armor glowing faintly, the runes slowly dimming after their final burst. His mithril sword was embedded deep in Gerhard's chest plate, piercing through the once imposing knight commander's armor. Gerhard's enormous spirit blade had dissipated, its fiery orange aura flickering out as he dropped to his knees, eyes wide in disbelief. His hand, still clutching the hilt of his now ordinary sword, trembled before he released it entirely, the weapon clattering onto the ground. Blood seeped from his mouth as he gasped for air, the last vestiges of his strength fading rapidly. The arena, once filled with the roar of battle, now echoed with an eerie silence. The crowd, still recovering from the blinding flash, stared in shock at the fallen knight who had seemed unstoppable. Robert's blade was now pointed directly at his opponent's face in a victorious stance, ready to decapitate him at a moment's notice. "Count Lawrence, I think the battle is over, it would be better to announce the victor, unless you wish, sir." Gerhard to die. Oh. Of course, you are right, Professor. While everyone was still trying to understand what happened, Roland quickly addressed Lawrence. His brother had critically injured his opponent, but his power armor's battery was almost gone. If this duel didn't end now, it could end badly for his brother. The duel is concluded. Robert Arden is victorious and now a free man. The declaration hung in the air for several moments before the audience processed the words. Only a small group of young women were cheering with tears coming down their eyes. They did it, the duel was over, and now that Count Lawrence announced the victor, Graham could not do anything about it. This confrontation had been won, but to Roland's surprise, this was not quite over. Shit! Release the mana barrier, now! He screamed while rushing forward after seeing a red glint in Gerhard's eyes. His whole face flushed red with bulging veins and his eyes widened in rage. The man, overtaken by his emotion, grasped his sword once more and ignored the verdict. His body barely moving but still capable of battle. Robert, on the other hand, saw the light inside of his visor go out as all the power had been drained during the confrontation. No. This isn't over. Robert could barely move in the heavy armor he now found himself trapped inside, and the previous exchange had left an opening near his chest. With one well-aimed thrust, Gerhard would be able to pierce through the armor entirely, delivering a direct blow to his body and likely killing him in the process. Roland slammed his hand against the barrier, quickly shattering its defenses, but not quickly enough to cast a spell that could save his brother. He could only shout and watch helplessly as the silvery blade approached the immobilized power armor. Just as all hope seemed lost, something miraculous happened. From an unknown location, a massive spear flew through the air and struck Gerhard square in the midsection. The spear tore through Gerhard's midsection with a sickening crunch, halting his final attack and propelling him off the ground. He was flung in the direction where Roland stood, flying straight through the gap in the mana shield. Roland had to quickly step aside as Gerhard crashed into the arena stands, sending up a cloud of dust. Glancing into the distance, Roland spotted a large figure approaching. The man wore a gleaming suit of silvery armor, with a massive wolf engraved on his chest. The crowd was stunned into silence. Gerhard, once the proud and indomitable knight commander, now lay crumpled in the stands like a broken marionette, impaled by the mysterious spear. His spirit blade had long since fizzled out, and the orange glow that had once radiated from him like an aura of invincibility was nothing more than a memory. Roland stood right next to the crash site, having witnessed the entire incident. His brother had nearly gotten himself killed after succumbing to something called blood crystal-induced madness. Though Gerhard had shown no initial side effects, it seemed that after suffering a crushing defeat and a severe injury, his mind had finally snapped. Just as he was about to deliver the killing blow, a spear was thrown. The same spear collided with the magical barrier, a shield designed to withstand Tier 3 strikes. Roland had managed to create a large hole on his side, but on the other side, where the spear came from, the barrier remained at full strength. Yet, the silvery mithril spear pierced through it with almost no resistance. The projectile struck Gerhard, sending him flying into the stands, where he now lay motionless, a giant pole protruding from his chest. Roland's gaze shifted from Gerhard's broken body to the arena's entrance. There, a towering figure clad in gleaming silver armor strode forward with authority and confidence. The wolf emblem on his chest plate gleamed under the sunlight, and his armor shimmered with brilliance, unlike anything the audience had ever seen. His steps were slow, deliberate, and the powerful aura surrounding him was undeniable. That armor, that wolf emblem. Did that bastard actually come? Roland's heart began to pound as he recognized the man. There was no mistaking it, his father, Wentworth Arden, had arrived. For over 10 years, Roland had managed to avoid him, hoping this day would never come. But here he was, wearing the fabled armor of the Silver Wolf, a legend within the kingdom's military. The arena fell into an even deeper silence as Wentworth Arden made his entrance, each step sending ripples of authority through the space. The barrier within the arena began to fizzle out as he moved through the stands. People started whispering, some recognizing the eye-catching armor he was famous for. Others glanced not at him, but at the figures behind him, heavily armored knights, all bearing the symbol of the crown. The symbol of Cauldres was also displayed on the Silver Wolf's armor, indicating that all of them were dressed in their military uniforms. Each of these men, knights or nobility of some rank, would typically bear their own personal crests and symbols. Yet, they all wore the markings of the royal family, suggesting they were part of an official unit, possibly one returning from a border skirmish. The royal crest of the Kingdom of Cauldres features a fearsome golden dragon, its wings unfurled and flames curling from its open maw, symbolizing strength. The dragon stood proudly in front of a shield with its tail coiled protectively around a golden sword that ran vertically through the center. Flanking the dragon were two roaring griffins, their talons gripping the edges of the shield. Above the shield rested a regal crown encrusted with rubies and sapphires, signifying the royal lineage. Encircling the crest was a bouquet of golden oak leaves, intertwined with silvery thorns. Roland's mind raced as he realized his father hadn't arrived alone. It was clear Wentworth had come with his own men, a contingent of knights now starting to file into the arena. Roland had anticipated some trouble, but due to the high concentration of mages at this event, he had been forced to pull back most of his golems, leaving only a few hidden in fringe areas of the estate, to be used once the duel was over. Somehow, though, his father had managed to arrive undetected, with reinforcements in tow. That armor, it's blocking my sensors. Is it generating some kind of magical jamming field? There had been some new dots appearing on the screen from some further away monitoring devices, but he was too focused on the duel to pay attention. Even with reduced external monitoring, Roland should have noticed more of them approaching. His system didn't warn him about a large increase in Tier 3 activity, which might have something to do with his father's armor. This only confirmed that the magical technology they were using was beyond anything he had encountered before. It also meant that there were ways that could go around his runes which would need to be addressed in the future. However, now wasn't the time for analysis. If he tried to investigate further, he was certain his father or one of the Tier 3 knights in his entourage would notice. Gerhardt's lifeless body, impaled by the spear, still lay in a grotesque heap near the stands, but even that gruesome sight was overshadowed by the towering man advancing toward the balcony with Count Graham and Lawrence. From the other side knights started pouring in. It seemed that even Graham was unaware of the arrival of his father, making it even more obvious that he had some sort of concealment device. What is the meaning of this? Who are you? Graham shouted as he rose from his seat, and the Grand Commander of his knights, Leopold, stepped forward to protect his master. Roland's heart raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. Judging by the spear throw, it seemed he was here to rescue Robert to some degree, yet he hadn't informed his sister or stepmother of his presence. The men accompanying him quickly moved to surround the area, taking control of the situation. It was clear they were not passive observers but were ready, if necessary, to confront Count Graham's soldiers. The crowd, which had been roaring with excitement over Robert's victory moments before, fell silent, holding its collective breath in anticipation of what might unfold. What is the meaning of this? Who are you to interrupt my event? Graham's voice, filled with false bravado, boomed through the arena as he asked the approaching man about his identity again. Wentworth, however, remained unfazed. His icy blue eyes scanned the battlefield below, lingering for a moment on Gerhardt's lifeless form before moving to his son, Robert, who was in the process of removing the helmet from his armor. The suit was devoid of magical energy but his Tier 2 strength was enough to still be able to move around in it. Graham's face contorted into a mixture of frustration as he noticed the man ignoring his calls as if he were the one in power here. My lord, this is Wentworth Arden, we must tread carefully. Before Graham could continue with the question, Leopold stepped in. Thanks to Roland's enhanced hearing and the help of his suit he could hear the whispers between the two. He commands a regiment in the Royal Army, his rank a Grand Knight Commander. It's Marshal now, Leopold. Maybe if you didn't choose to leave the Royal Army, you might have reached this position as well and not stagnated here, a shame. While listening, Roland learned new details about his father's achievements. He knew that strength didn't always dictate rank, and some nobles despised his father for his strong reputation. When he left the Arden estate, Wentworth had held the rank of Grand Knight Commander, a position that granted him command over a regiment of up to 5,000 soldiers. The rank of Grand Knight Commander was the highest a knight could achieve in their lifetime, a pinnacle of success, but still not the top of the hierarchy. Upon receiving a noble title, a knight could rise higher, attaining the rank of Marshal. A Marshal commanded a division of 3 regiments, or about 15,000 soldiers. Beyond that were the positions of High Marshal and Grand Marshal, ranks that required the bearer to be at least a Viscount. Oh dear, this doesn't look good at all. No, it does not, but I think he's on our side, at least for now. Let's just wait and watch. I doubt they'll escalate it much further. As Roland eavesdropped on the nobles, his friend Arion finally made his presence known. The small black feline had been hiding in the stands, pretending to be nothing more than a pet. Roland knew that Graham wouldn't allow another Tier 3 mage to oversee the duel, so they had agreed to keep Arion's true identity concealed as he still wanted to witness the prototype in action. Now that the duel was over, there was no longer any need for him to remain hidden. Marshal, no Baron Arden, don't you think that you've gone too far? What gives you the right to come to my house, uninvited and unannounced, Baron? Are those soldiers of yours supposed to intimidate me? People began to slowly back away as the two nobles continued their conversation, sensing that a battle could erupt at any moment. Wentworth was pushing his luck by secretly bringing a large number of his own soldiers into another noble's territory, an act that could easily be interpreted as a declaration of war, something permissible among nobility. The crown allowed nobles to settle disputes through battle, even to the point of seizing each other's lands and titles if they had a justifiable cause. The kingdom operated under a feudal system, with nobles serving as feudal lords and the king as their only superior. While they were obligated to answer the crown's call and mobilize during times of need, most of the time, they were left to govern their lands independently. I apologize for my sudden arrival, Count. However, some information had reached my ears that involved my son and how well you've been taking care of him. Wentworth finally came to a stop, his men fanning out behind him while Count Graham's knights moved forward to protect their leader. They all remained tense, hands hovering over their weapons. The tension was palpable and the words were laced with hidden threats. What you're implying is that I have somehow wronged your son, Baron? Me? After what he did to my daughter? I assure you, I had reasonable grounds to punish him and he was a willing participant in this duel. I gave him a chance to prove himself. Prove himself against that coward? Who would backstab him, once he lost an honorable duel? Are those sorts of men that you bring up, Count? You should watch your tone, Baron. The two men stared daggers into each other. Even though Wentworth was much fiercer than Graham, the Count did not relent. Both were old masters of their own trade, versed in how this world operated. They were still aware that if a battle broke out, it could spiral out of control, dragging them and their houses into a conflict both would suffer in. Spectators swallowed hard while trying to leave, but all the exits were closed off by knights. Gentlemen, please calm yourselves. Before the conversation could continue any more, Count Lawrence finally intervened. He was in a more neutral position, not really on the side of either of these two. From his perspective this was unbecoming of nobility and he had decided to stop them before things got out of hand. Both of you, this is unbecoming of your positions, you should discuss this like men, not like uncivilized brutes. This is a place for honor and tradition, not petty squabbles. The two men looked at the rotund Count Lawrence, who was trying to meditate, and nodded begrudgingly. It was clear that they had differences with each other, but this didn't mean that they needed to go to war. Instead, it was better to take care of it like nobles and deliberate on a solution that would allow both sides to maintain their honor. Let us step back and consider a better solution. Why don't we retreat and converse first, before you let yourselves be dragged into a conflict that could have dire consequences for all involved? Wentworth remained silent, and so did Graham. Both of them were looking at each other, though Roland's father's face was concealed with the helmet that was shaped like a wolf's head. Eventually, the large man of over 2 meters of height nodded in approval. Count Lawrence of Lothston is right, perhaps we should discuss this issue, in private. Very well. Graham scratched his chin while nodding thoughtfully. He had underestimated what he was dealing with and had lost himself in anger, but now his mind was starting to work clearly. The man he was up against was not so simple. If he had known his new position, he might have simply asked for gold and for Robert to be stripped of his title. Now that he was here and the duel was lost, the deal he could negotiate would be much worse. Everyone, I must apologize for these circumstances, but I ask that you remain in the arena for now. Once the Baron and I have cleared up this issue, you will be allowed to leave. The people present were Graham's guests, but there was no one above him in rank except Lawrence. If he told them to remain, they would have no choice but to comply. He was painfully aware that he had been made to look a fool. His knight had lost and even attempted to dishonor him by trying to kill Robert after Lawrence's announcement. If Wentworth hadn't arrived, things would have been much simpler. Now, Robert was still alive, and the duel had ended. It would be best if no one here was granted the freedom to announce anything that transpired. He glanced at one of his mages, signaling for him to accompany them for this delicate conversation. It would probably be unwise to eavesdrop this time. Roland was forced to watch as his father left with the counts, heading toward a nearby side chamber behind the balcony. Just before disappearing from view, his father glanced directly in Roland's direction. His face was concealed by a specially crafted helmet resembling a wolf, but through the narrow slits, Roland could see his eyes. Though the gaze lingered for only a fraction of a second, it felt as though a mountain was bearing down on him. The moment passed quickly, and his father vanished into the chamber beyond the balcony. The room was well beyond Roland's reach, protected by powerful magical enchantments that blocked any attempt at eavesdropping. Activating his golems now would be far too risky as there were too many soldiers nearby, and he still had to keep his identity hidden. "Madam, please calm down." "You want me to calm down now? My son had almost gotten himself killed. Now let me through this instant." His gaze shifted to some shouts coming from the audience. While most people just whispered between each other, one particular woman was screaming at one of the Count's knights. To make things worse, a few knights from Wentworth's faction approached her with an intent to support her claim. "Back away from the madam." This was, of course, his stepmother, Francine. She, along with Lucienne, had seen Wentworth make his entrance and were now clamoring for answers. However, the order to remain was clear, and defying it would only cause more trouble. Roland could tell that Francine was more interested in her son than in her husband, and he was capable of providing her with some peace. "Arian, it would be better if you didn't involve yourself in this." "You don't have to tell me twice, but what are you going to do?" "It's too late for now, I'm going to see how the prototype is holding out and get Robert out of it." Roland had already presented himself as a haughty mage from the Institute, so he saw no issue in continuing that persona. He rose gently into the air with the help of a levitation spell and propelled himself slowly into the arena. The other mages and soldiers watched him move, but no one stopped him as he assumed the role of Robert's squire. He descended gracefully into the arena, his cloak floating slightly behind him. Some glanced in his direction but did not react. Even the ones who had arrived with Wentworth remained still, as if they knew he was aligned with Robert and meant no harm. They had likely been briefed on the situation before the duel, aware that Wayland the mage stood with Lucienne and Robert. As Roland approached, he noticed the strain etched on his brother's face. Moving around in the heavy, depot-ward dark power armor was no easy task. Robert had managed to dislodge the large helmet but couldn't free himself from the rest of the suit without assistance. Only after Roland channeled some of his mana into the magical machine did the clasps unbind, allowing the back of the armor to open and release Robert. The battle was over, and the duel won, yet the air hung thick with tension. More trouble was brewing, and Roland wasn't certain what the near future held. Roland knelt beside his brother as Robert leaned against the broken stationary suit. The older Arden's face was drenched in sweat, his skin pale from the exertion and the rush of adrenaline that had yet to fully fade. The power armor he had used had suffered some damage, but it was still operational, a testament to the genius of the craftsmen that took part in its assembly. Just give me a moment." "I'm fine." Robert panted, refusing to take Roland's hand when it was offered. The two remained silent for a moment, both still trying to process what had just happened. Neither had expected their father to appear, and now they were each trying to make sense of it. Robert's thoughts leaned in a more positive direction, but Roland felt far more suspicious. Roland's mind swirled with questions about his father. They hadn't seen each other in over 10 years, and Roland had hoped never to see him again. The glance his father gave him sent shivers down his spine, reminding him of the deep mistrust he harbored. While this body belonged to Roland Arden, the soul inhabiting it was someone else's. His recent dealings with the spiritualist had revealed that there were ways to expose his true identity, which could provoke any number of reactions from Wentworth Arden. Though Roland had made adjustments to his runic equipment to help mask his soul from being examined again, he wasn't confident it would hold up against powerful Tier 4 class holders like that spiritualist witch. Even if his true identity remained hidden, he still didn't know what his standing in the Arden estate would be. His father might have the power to pull him back and disrupt the life he had grown accustomed to. His secret wasn't exposed yet, but Roland wasn't sure how long he could keep it that way. He did glance in my direction for a moment. Does he know? Or was it about something else? Roland's mind raced as he tried to decipher both his father's motives and the extent of his power. The spear his father had thrown was his only clue. It pierced through the magical barrier as easily as an arrow through paper and suggested he was at least on par with the Grand Knight Commander. However, his martial status hinted that he could be even stronger, possibly a Tier 4 class holder. Roland considered trying to read his father's status, but with so many people around, he feared it might draw unwanted attention. The numerous mages in the vicinity could easily detect his attempt, and given that his father had already managed to conceal his troops from his golem's sensors, it was likely Roland wouldn't be able to read his status anyway. They might use it as an excuse to detain me and go through my status. I shouldn't assume that he knows who I am just yet. Lucienne had written letters to her parents and revealed his involvement in the Viola case. To the Ardens he was still known as Professor Wayland from Xandar's Institute of Wizardry, and he wanted to keep it like that. Francine knew nothing of his true identity, and his siblings would not reveal anything either. Now that the duel was over, his job had been done and he could just retreat back to the Institute and also go home. His work here was done and returning to Albrook should be his only concern now. Thus, it was best to take care of the surface-level problems now and help his brother to get back to his mother. You shouldn't let your mother and sister worry, sir. Robert, take my hand and drink this potion, it will restore your stamina. Roland helped his brother up, despite Robert's initial refusal. His mother Francine was shouting in the background while being unable to climb down into the arena. Roland handed his brother a small vial, a stamina-restoring potion, glowing faintly with a light orange hue. Robert hesitated for a moment, his pride wrestling with his exhaustion, but in the end, he took the vial and drank it in one gulp. His breath began to steady, and color returned to his face as the potion's effects took hold. Thank you, Master Wayland. Robert muttered, finally accepting Roland's outstretched hand as he stood. You'll need your strength. Roland said quietly, keeping his gaze steady as his brother dusted himself off. Your mother's waiting. Robert's gaze shifted to where Francine was now arguing heatedly with one of Count Graham's knights, her face red with frustration. The knights from their father's contingent loomed nearby, clearly uneasy but unwilling to escalate things without direct orders. Meanwhile, Lucienne stood a few meters away from their mother, her expression unreadable as she observed the tense situation. She's not going to stop until she sees that her son is alive and well, go to her. I know, thank you again. As Robert finally steadied himself, he gave Roland a faint smile, one that carried both gratitude and exhaustion. He looked toward his mother and sister, knowing that this ordeal was far from over. He was not truly safe yet and the woman he loved was still out of his reach. With a nod, he began to make his way across the arena, his steps still somewhat unsteady but his resolve firm. Roland watched him go, feeling some relief. He had done what he came here to do, protected his brother and ensured the duel's outcome was in their favor. Yet, the undercurrents swirling around him were impossible to ignore. Wentworth's unexpected arrival had thrown everything into uncertainty. As Robert approached his mother, Francine's anger melted away, replaced by clear concern. She rushed toward the edge of the arena in an attempt to see him but had to wait for Robert to jump up. Now that he had recovered and his legs weren't all wobbly from the tension, he easily made his way there. His clothes surprised the onlookers as he was wearing a skin-tight suit made out of silver grace metal, just like Roland did under his own armor. Robert. Are you really fine? We need to get a priest. Mother, I'm fine, just tired. Roland remained in the shadows, observing the family reunion from a distance. He knew that stepping closer would only raise unnecessary questions, especially from his stepmother, who had no idea of his true identity. The last thing he needed was to be drawn into their family drama when there were far larger issues at hand. He could see them finally hug and embrace, Francine crying along with his sister Lucienne. The girls from the institute teared up behind them and all seemed well. However, for him not everything was over and his gaze shifted towards the power armor. Now that the duel was over, all eyes were on it. The rich merchants, nobles, and even the soldiers that arrived here were staring at the runic machine that produced a miracle. It went better than expected, but the operation time needs expanding, could fix that with a more modular battery pack or a recharge station of some kind, perhaps even a golem, but first, I should probably pack it up. His mind was buzzing with possible improvements, but this was not the time to deliberate future endeavors. This suit of armor had become a symbol of power, innovation and, most importantly, a potential target. Roland understood that the moment the duel ended, the nobles and merchants would begin to consider the military applications of such a device. Eyes filled with both curiosity and greed fixated on the armor. If he didn't move quickly, questions would be asked, and offers would be made that could lead to unwanted entanglements. They are really watching. Every step he took, every move he made and even every breath he took, people from the audience were watching him. Count Graham and his father were discussing the issue and probably trying to resolve it without a fight breaking out. Graham's soldiers outnumbered the military unit his father brought along, but they were all elites. Many Tier 3 class holders were in the audience and many of them were wearing similarly styled silver mithril armor. If I try to leave now, I will be detained, but at least I should be able to take this away, they have no right to take it. As Roland approached the armor, he pulled out his suitcase and placed it down on the ground to unfold itself. Quickly the mages around him realized that he was using some type of spatial item as the mana signature was quite obvious. While it was unfolding, some people started shouting, demanding to know what he was up to. The shouts from the audience grew louder, but Roland ignored them. In his mind, this would be something that an eccentric mage would be doing, silently hiding his creation from prying eyes. Hey! What are you doing? Stand down, mage, the Count did not give you permission. I don't need his permission. His voice, amplified by magic, responded to one of the knight commanders shouting in his direction. His suit of armor was now being lifted by his magic and carefully placed into the spatial suitcase. Soon, it began to descend slowly and disappeared from view. Without pausing, he let the case fold itself back into place before picking it up again. While he was playing with fire, without the leaders out here, the soldiers couldn't do much. They were probably ordered to just stand and watch, but if I try to leave they will attempt to stop me. For a moment, he considered using his hidden glider to flee the scene but decided against it. It was better to wait for a peaceful resolution to the situation. He was confident that his father would somehow arrange things in Robert's favor, and they would be allowed to leave. It wasn't worth pushing his luck with so many mages and soldiers around. If he had some fast-acting teleportation technology, escape might have been an option, but for now, that wasn't an option. Thus, even as the soldiers shouted, he remained silent and waited. He had taken the power armor off the arena but still remained lingering in the shadows. Eyes were on him, but he decided to just lean up against one of the arena's walls and wait. Count Graham's soldiers had their hands on their weapons, but none made a move, clearly awaiting further orders. Wentworth's soldiers, elite and well-trained, stood as a silent threat but didn't move either. His brother was focused on his sister and mother, who was in the process of giving him a scolding. Eventually, everyone's whispers ceased as they all were reminded of the situation they were in. At any moment a battle could break out and they were waiting for the nobles to come back and give the verdict. Roland wished he could eavesdrop, but this situation showcased him that he wasn't quite as strong as he thought he was. Ever since he achieved Tier 3 he had been winning all his confrontations, but since returning to the main continent, his true position revealed itself. Even if he prepared for months and had the best weapons, he still couldn't compete with the true elites of this land. This was a harsh reminder of the power dynamics at play in the world of nobility and class holders. His inventions and quick thinking had given him an edge, but in the grander scheme of things, there were forces beyond his control. I need to get back into the dungeon and get more levels. He had spent years refining his skills in the relative isolation of Dragness Island and Albrook. In the quiet town, he was rarely disturbed, though the challenges he faced were still great. If he had more time and strength, even the Count and his father's elite troops wouldn't be able to stop him. However, reaching that level of power likely wouldn't happen until he attained the pinnacle of what a Tier 3 could achieve or crossed into Tier 4 territory. The wait continued, people murmured but no one dared to protest. Suddenly all voices died down and signaled the return of the nobles from their private deliberation. Roland's gaze shifted toward the side chamber as Count Graham, Wentworth Arden, and Count Lawrence emerged. Their faces were unreadable, but the air around them crackled with unresolved tension. There was a change in his father's appearance as the helmet he had previously been wearing had come off. This was the first time he had seen the man in over 10 years, but his face didn't change much. He still had the same scar trailing from his left eyebrow to his upper lip. His hair seemed more white than silver and was much longer. His face was covered by an untrimmed white beard which just made him look more imposing than ever. Wentworth stepped forward first, his voice booming across the arena with a calm authority that instantly silenced any remaining whispers. The matter between Count Graham and myself has been resolved. There will be no further hostilities today. Robert Arden will return with me to the Arden estate. The terms of his duel have been honored, and there will be no further punishments. Count Graham, though clearly still simmering with frustration, nodded in reluctant agreement. Yes. Robert has proven himself in combat, and I shall honor the outcome of the duel, as agreed. This matter is settled. There was an audible release of tension from the crowd, though some spectators remained visibly disappointed that the conflict hadn't escalated into a full-blown confrontation. Roland, however, felt a wave of relief wash over him. At least for now, the situation has been defused. His attention remained on his father as this was not quite over yet. Robert, now standing beside their mother and sister, looked visibly relieved, though exhaustion still clung to his features. However, I would have to remain here, at least for the time being. Before people had time to relax, Graham spoiled their mood. Roland could feel that something wasn't right with his tone, and so did the others. One of the lesser nobles that were there with him posed a question, his voice trembling slightly. Your lordship, what do you mean? Don't be alarmed, nothing bad will happen. The Baron and Count Lawrence have agreed to take some action about today's event. I wish for you all to sign a contract, one that will assure that word of what has happened today doesn't escape beyond these walls. A ripple of unease spread through the gathered crowd. The nobles, merchants, and other onlookers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright alarm. Forcing silence through magical contracts was no trivial matter, especially among the nobility, where information was often currency more valuable than gold. I understand this may come as a surprise, but I believe we can all agree that the events today were delicate. As a precaution, we have agreed that everyone present will swear to a binding contract of secrecy. Don't worry, you will also be compensated. Wentworth Arden stood still, his towering presence a silent reinforcement of the necessity of this decision. His piercing gaze scanned the whole area, daring anyone to object. Roland, who remained leaning against the arena wall, was somewhat confused about what the nobles had decided on. Wait, isn't this good for me? If they all are forced to sign a contract, then no info about the power armor will leak out, at least not immediately. A murmur spread as a few voices from the crowd expressed their displeasure. However, they did not raise their hands or ask for the nobles to reconsider. If it was just a simple contract that kept them from mentioning what had transpired during this short duel, then it was still reasonable. Some were even happy that they would be compensated for their silence, but one question still needed to be answered. Would they force me to sign it too? Roland was not someone who liked signing binding contracts. The deal sounded even worse when it involved his father or Count Graham. The problem wasn't so much about him having trouble keeping his word, but rather the risk of leaving his mana pattern or signature on paper. Certain people with special abilities could potentially use such a contract to track his location, something he wanted to avoid. Now that he had put himself in the crosshairs of the Count, the man might seek revenge. Even if Robert was safe, it didn't mean assassins couldn't be sent his way. However, after the speech was given and the contracts were being finalized, instead of being approached by the Count's men, one of the knights from his father's unit moved toward him. The knight was clad in a full suit of mithril armor, gleaming and glistening under the sunlight light. He approached slowly to relay an order from his commanding officer. The Marshal wishes to see you. Please come with me. You want me to come with you? Roland's heart sank as the armored knight approached. His father, Wentworth Arden, wanted to see him. After years of distance and the hidden identity he held, this was the one situation Roland had been hoping to avoid. Nevertheless, refusing wasn't an option, especially not in a public arena surrounded by soldiers, nobles, and mages, all under his father's watchful eye. Certainly, the Lord Marshal has ordered me to guide you to him. Please follow me, Lord Mage. The knight commander was cordial, but there was an implied threat in his mannerisms. He had approached alone, yet many other soldiers and knights were watching intently. A mage, dressed strangely, stood in a hidden position with a staff pointed in his direction. It was clear this wasn't a mere suggestion, it was an order. As a man from the Institute, there was no real reason to refuse the summons. A normal person might assume that the Marshal simply wanted to thank him. After all, Robert was Wentworth's son, and he had survived thanks to Roland's invention. However, the duel had been a reckless plan, for which Roland could be blamed. It was entirely possible that he would be reprimanded or even attacked for putting a noble's son in danger. Does he know who I am, or is he just trying to figure out who the man is that's been getting involved with his children? Roland's involvement with Lucienne, Wentworth's third daughter, was well known. Francine had likely informed others that he had helped Lucienne during the Viola incident and continued to protect her at the Institute. Now, with him aiding Robert as well, it could easily be seen as suspicious. No ordinary person would go out of their way to help members of the same family without some ulterior motive. His reason, however, was simple: they were all related by blood, and he felt sympathy for his brother. Yet, he wasn't ready to part with his Wayland persona just yet, and refusing this invitation wasn't an option. Very well, lead the way. With a deep breath, Roland pushed off from the wall and gave the knight a small nod. He made sure to conceal his voice behind layers of mana. Though his father had not been there to witness him grow up, Roland's voice was similar to Robert's. The connection could be made, so it had to remain hidden. The knight, surprisingly, gestured toward one of the side exits of the arena rather than the stairs leading up into the stands. The merchants and lesser nobles were being made to wait here, as they all needed to sign the contract. However, for some reason, Roland wasn't being given the same treatment. Graham and Lawrence had already left, leaving behind their knights and those loyal to Wentworth. The two groups were working together to manage the crowd, but it seemed they had different plans for him, something that could potentially be bad. The exit he was guided to was the same one Gerhard had used earlier. It first led to the room where he had been preparing, much larger and more lavish than the one Robert had been given. He wondered how the knight knew his way around, but perhaps they had planned for this confrontation and gotten detailed plans of the whole estate. Other members of their group were stationed here as well, scattered throughout the tunnel leading out of the arena. Once outside, Roland could finally grasp the full scale of Wentworth's entourage. The number of personnel he had brought along was striking. They were stationed all around the estate, and had even surrounded it. His mapping device was now back to detecting everyone, though he was curious about how they had managed to evade it earlier. It seemed the military had methods to fool even his advanced sensors, something that not even other Tier 3 class holders or most magic could do. As he observed them, a growing sense of unease crept over him. The knight led him to a courtyard behind the estate. It was vast, with towering hedges and ornate statues scattered about. In the center stood Wentworth Arden, still clad in his silvery armor, though his face was now fully revealed. It appeared that Graham had ceded this area to Wentworth for the time being, though the Count was nowhere to be seen. Both parties seemed to be watching each other, though tensions had eased. Roland suspected that some kind of unbreakable agreement had been made. They probably signed a temporary non-aggression contract. I've read that the army carries a few for situations like this. It wouldn't be surprising if this had been Wentworth's plan all along. It would have been nice if he contacted Robert or his wife of his intent. Roland was somewhat irritated by how the entire situation had been handled. Had he known his father was on the way with the army, he would never have pushed for the duel. Instead, he would have fought the matter in court. He probably could have postponed the trial without needing to build any power armor. Now, he had exposed his hand to anyone who had witnessed the duel and brought trouble to his doorstep. All of this could have been avoided if his father had shown even a modicum of interest in Robert. Please wait here. When Roland arrived, he noticed that his father wasn't alone. Robert, Lucien, and even Francine were there. It was quite the family reunion, yet something felt off. Mages had cast a silencing spell around the group, but Roland could see and hear through such trivial tricks. Even without using outer spells, his suit could read their lips, and it was clear that Robert was furious. The veins on his neck bulged, and he was shouting loudly, but Wentworth didn't seem particularly alarmed. "Father, please reconsider. Don't make me repeat myself, boy. You shall not meet with that Devere girl, now or ever." Wentworth shook his head, maintaining his stern tone, but Robert didn't back down, which was surprising. He had just survived a life-and-death battle, and his nerves were frayed. Normally, his brother would have retreated in the face of their overbearing patriarch, but not this time. He stood firm, holding on to his beliefs as he continued to plead. "How can you say such a thing? You must reconsider. She does not want this, I do not want this." It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. Graham had struck a deal with Wentworth to keep Robert away from his daughter. He likely agreed to let bygones be bygones, but only under that one condition. Though Robert had won the duel and was now free to pursue his lover, Lucille, this was something Graham deeply disapproved of. Allowing it to continue would only spark a war between the two noble houses, something neither side wanted. To avoid that, a deal had been made, one that ensured Robert would never pursue her again. "That's enough, take him away. Father. You can't just..." Before Robert could finish, Wentworth's patience had run out. He signalled to his knights, who promptly moved to restrain Robert and escort him away. "Dear, please, he is your son, he might still be injured." Francine jumped in to protect her son as two men held his arms and dragged him away. Robert was thrashing around in protest, but the two men were above his level of strength. Nevertheless, he was still not letting up and thrashing around in an attempt to free himself. The knights that were handling him were starting to have trouble, and eventually, he even started to slip away. However, even after freeing one of his arms, he quickly found his father standing before him, with his fist embedded in his gut. "Take him away and keep watch, don't let him out of your sight until we return." Robert slumped forward after a devastating blow to his stomach. His eyes quickly rolled back, and he collapsed unconscious into Wentworth's arms. Without a word, Wentworth handed his son's limp body over to the knights, his face devoid of emotion. Francine gasped in horror, reaching out as Robert was dragged away, but a stern look from Wentworth stopped her in her tracks. "How could you? He's your son." She started to sob, her voice trembling, but Wentworth replied in a cold tone. Francine, enough. This is for his own good. He'll understand in time. Lucienne stood nearby, frozen, watching helplessly as her brother was taken away. Her wide eyes were filled with disbelief, but fear kept her silent. She knew better than to challenge their father, especially at a time like this. Roland, on the other hand, remained still, simply waiting as Robert was hauled out, with Francine following closely behind. Robert would likely be locked away, tossed into a carriage, and sent back to the Arden estate. They might even keep him there until she gets married. The situation was spiraling out of control. It was clear Robert had made up his mind, and perhaps Roland was partially to blame. He was the one who had placed the golem in Lucille's tower, reigniting the flames of their love. Now that Robert had survived the duel and was a free man, he could genuinely ask for her hand in marriage. Perhaps they were even planning to renounce their noble titles and vanish together, something neither of their families would tolerate. The two noble houses would likely do everything in their power to keep Robert away from Lucille, perhaps even going so far as to threaten her to ensure Lucille proceeded with her arranged marriage. The world of nobility truly didn't see marriage as nothing more than a way to further their power. They would probably be fine if both saw each other on the side as long as Lucille didn't take him on as an official husband. This has truly turned into a shit show. Robert deserves better than this. Roland thought, gripping his suitcase tighter. His mind was racing with the ramifications of everything that had just happened. Count Graham's deal with Wentworth ensured that Robert would be cut off from Lucille, but Roland had no illusions. His brother wasn't the type to give up easily. Especially not now. This wasn't the end of the story, it was merely another chapter in a growing tragedy. However, before any of that could be addressed, he needed to figure out his own standing first. Wentworth, still in the courtyard, turned his gaze toward Roland. For a brief moment, their eyes met. His were covered by his metal helmet in an attempt to shield himself, but his father's were exposed. Wentworth's eyes were cold and calculating, the kind of look that pierced through anyone daring to stand against him. A part of Roland wondered if his father truly didn't know who he was or if it was just being tested. Perhaps this was it and there was no use running away anymore. Deputy Professor Wayland, was it? Yes. Please, sit. It was an uncomfortable situation, to say the least, as one of the knights offered him a chair. They were seated in a temporary area of Count Graham's estate, near where tea was being served. Wentworth was either being surprisingly cordial or preparing to annihilate him the moment he stepped out of line. Surrounded from every angle, Roland knew that even with all his inventions, there would be no way to escape. He wanted to gauge his opponents, to read their intentions, but in this setting, it was impossible. The only thing he could do was nod and quietly take his seat. Just as he did, Wentworth instantly started talking and set off quite a bomb inside of his mind. I will make this short, I know of your true identity. Roland's heartbeat instantly increased as those words left his father's lips. Wentworth's piercing gaze bore into him, and for a brief moment, Roland felt his carefully constructed world begin to unravel. His first instinct was to deny it, to dismiss his father's words as a mere bluff, but deep down, he knew. Wentworth wasn't the kind of man to speak idly or make hollow accusations. Still, Roland forced himself to remain outwardly calm, leaning back slightly in his chair to mask the tension rising within him. His mind raced through a dozen potential responses, but none felt sufficient. His silence hung heavily in the air as Wentworth continued to speak, each word deliberate and carefully measured. I have harbored my suspicions for some time now. First, you approach my daughter, then my son. There can be but one explanation, one reason behind it all, and your silence only confirms that I am right. Roland's pulse increased as his heart continued pounding. His identity, carefully hidden for years, was now laid bare before the one man he least wanted to know it. Wentworth Arden was no fool, and it seemed Roland had underestimated just how keen his father's instincts were. There was little point in pretending any longer, yet the thought of revealing the truth he had concealed for so long paralyzed him. Instead, he remained silent and allowed his father to continue. I'll be brief, then. Tell her to stay out of this. I do not require, nor desire, her assistance. Hey? Excuse me. The sentence that left Wentworth's mouth was not something he expected, but his father seemed to think that he was just trying to deny it. There is no need to conceal it any longer. She commanded you to do this, did she not? Who else would take such an interest in my daughter, or my son? It is all her doing, is it not? Yes. Roland was genuinely confused by the turn of the conversation. His secret was on the verge of being exposed, but instead, the discussion veered in an unexpected direction. He needed a few seconds to reset his mind and realize what Wentworth was misunderstanding. By her he meant the institute leader, Yavana Arvanduz. She was the institute leader and his direct superior, so mistaking his intentions as an order wasn't that strange. It also seemed that Wentworth was acquainted with her through some means, which made this misunderstanding possible. Roland felt a wave of relief wash over him, for now, his true identity seemed to remain intact. Still, he needed to tread carefully, as Wentworth was no fool and his suspicions were dangerously close to the truth. Roland cleared his throat, choosing his next words with precision. I see there's been a misunderstanding. The Institute has its interests, of course, but my involvement with Sir Robert and Lucienne Arden was my decision. I felt it was my duty as a teacher to help. Although Yavana Arvanduz made for a convenient scapegoat, Roland didn't know her well. She was a powerful Tier 4 mage who could easily become enraged if she heard her name being misused. Wentworth knew her to some extent, and there was a chance he might mention Roland's involvement in the future, so it was best to distance himself from the situation. You truly expect me to believe this is mere coincidence? That you've woven yourself into my children's lives, and it has naught to do with her influence? Do you take me for a fool? It didn't seem that his father didn't believe him. Luckily, he didn't seem that offended by his claims and instead sent words of commendation. It is commendable that you would go to such lengths. I imagine it cannot be easy serving that woman. Let us leave this matter unspoken, then. You have my gratitude for saving both my reckless son and my daughter, Professor Wayland. Roland didn't reply and remained silent as it didn't seem that Wentworth was buying any of it. The words that were spoken carried a strange undercurrent of respect and understanding. It was as if the Archmage had done something similar to him and he now saw himself in Roland's shoes. The misunderstanding was deep and perhaps it was better to not say anything if he wouldn't be believed. If he was asked about it later, he could just claim that Wentworth assumed something without letting him speak, which was the truth. There is no need to thank me, Lord Marshal. I merely did what the situation required. You have done far more than what was required. While I do not condone Robert's reckless actions, you saved him when others failed. And as for Lucienne, I have heard of your dealings with the House of Castellane and their knights. You have risked much for my family, and for that, I shall remain ever in your debt. Roland was utterly baffled by the situation. He had been bracing himself for exposure in front of his overbearing father, but instead, he was being thanked. Wentworth continued to praise his role in the Viola incident and even seemed aware of the 3 Cerberus knights he had slain. Now, unexpectedly, he found himself a benefactor of House Arden, with the approval of its patriarch, something he had neither anticipated nor intended. Ha! I just want to go home. All he wanted was to cry and leave, but for some reason, his father wouldn't stop talking. The once stoic figure was starting to unravel as he rambled on about their home and family, leaving Roland even more bewildered. The family estate shall always be open to you, should you ever find the need for respite. Perhaps, during your stay, you might entertain the notion of sparring with my sons. Your sons? Indeed. They are in need of further training, and a seasoned mage such as yourself could impart invaluable lessons upon them. I shall give it thought, Lord Marshal, but I'm not much of a combat teacher. The conversation between Roland and his father continued for a few more minutes. The man seemed quite different than he remembered him. Back when he was between the ages of 5 and 10, Wentworth was quite distant and the family dinners with him around steadily decreased in time. Is he the type that opens up to people only if they are of a certain rank or strength? His father was aware that he had helped Lucienne and that the 3 Baskerville knights had probably died due to his involvement. This was perhaps enough to earn him some level of respect in his father's eyes. Wentworth Arden seemed to be the kind of man who valued strength and loyalty above all else, and Roland's recent actions had apparently earned him favor, albeit through a tangled web of misunderstandings. However, as the conversation drifted through more pleasantries, Roland couldn't shake the unease growing in the pit of his stomach. His father's sudden warmth felt temporary and if he discovered the truth about Roland's real identity, things would quickly turn sour. Roland had already seen Robert hauled away by the knights, and if he wasn't careful, he would be the next to feel his father's wrath. So, he subtly tried steering the conversation in a different direction. Speaking of your sons, what are your intentions with the young Robert? The question shifted the tone of the conversation immediately. Wentworth's posture straightened, his previously calm demeanor going cold. He remained silent for a moment, eyes narrowing as if he were weighing the importance of Roland's inquiry. My intentions. Wentworth paused for a moment to gather his thoughts and soon after responded in a rather cold tone. Robert is my son, but he is also a noble of the Arden family. His actions, reckless as they are, reflect upon our name, and I will not allow him to tarnish it further. Once we return, he will have to reflect on his actions. Roland halted his response, realizing he had just touched on a deeply personal matter. The tension between Robert and Wentworth was clear, but he knew better than to press too hard. Instead, he took a more neutral approach. I understand your concerns, Lord Marshal. But Robert's spirit is strong. He was somewhat naive but his heart was in the right place. Wentworth raised an eyebrow, and the shift in his demeanor was noticeable. Roland didn't want his brother to be locked away at the Arden estate, but things seemed to be heading in that direction. The entire arrangement between the two nobles appeared to be leading to Robert being held captive until Lucille eloped with another noble. It was even plausible they would pressure her into it, using Robert as a bargaining chip. If she refused to marry, he could be imprisoned for quite some time. You believe you know what's best for my son, Professor Wayland? Roland wanted to press the issue but knew his words would fall on deaf ears. His father was a notoriously stubborn man, and though Roland had earned some of his recognition, it was best not to push his luck. Robert's situation was unfortunate, but trying to sway this immovable man would likely only make things worse for both of them. Of course not, Lord Marshal. I would never presume to know what's best for your son. I merely wished to express my concern for him. His spirit is resilient, but he is still young. His intentions, while rash, stem from a place of affection. I'm sure that with some of your guidance, he will channel that energy in a way that honors your family name. Wentworth remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he weighed Roland's words. For a moment, Roland thought his father would dismiss him entirely, but then the older man leaned back slightly, his expression softening. Your words speak with a certain understanding of the issue, but these are matters of my house and will be handled by my house. Roland nodded and took this as a chance to end this conversation. While he wanted to prod about what his father was up to and what his intentions were, he was still nothing more than an outsider. Wentworth was aware that he interacted with both his children and probably knew some of their issues, but it didn't seem that he was willing to hear him list them out. I understand, Lord Marshal, I won't bring it up again. For a moment, it seemed like Wentworth wanted to say something but held himself back. It was as if he wanted to ask about something but decided that it was improper to do so. Let's put my son's affairs aside. There are more pressing matters at hand. Wentworth said, breaking the brief silence, and went into the next topic. My son, though gifted in his own right, could never hope to best a trained knight of such strength. Professor, how did you come to accomplish such a feat? And what is the true nature of this imposing armor? Roland steadied himself. This was one of the issues he was worried about, his power armor. While Wentworth was not there from the start, he had seen the large armor his son crawled out from. He knew there was no way that Robert would be able to defeat a knight commander in a fair fight. The rules in the duel were strict but allowed the use of magical equipment on both sides. Lord Marshal, I know what you wish to ask of me, but I can't relinquish the secrets of the Institute. I see. One of Wentworth's misunderstandings was that Roland was merely acting on orders from the Archmagus of the Institute. Although his father held a high position, he wasn't above her authority. His father seemed cautious whenever her name was mentioned, making it convenient for Roland to use her as a shield to deflect any troubling questions that might reveal his true identity. Since his father didn't seem eager to speak with her directly, it was only natural that he refrained from pressing the issue further. The Institute's secrets are closely guarded, I understand that. I only asked because it is rare to see such effective magic used in the form of armor capable of dispatching a Tier 3 knight. I'm sure even the royal family would be interested in such technology if it were to become widely available. Wentworth's voice carried a hint of curiosity, but Roland sensed the weight behind his words. His father was a soldier at heart, having fought in the border skirmishes in the north, and he could clearly see the potential of the power armor in securing future victories. However, Roland had no desire to entangle himself in his father's affairs or become a supplier of these suits, at least not yet. I'm afraid that my invention is nothing more than an expensive toy. While it's capable to some degree, the costs outweigh the benefits for widespread use. The materials alone are rare, and the eloquence fluid required to power it, well, the costs would be astronomical. It's a prototype more than anything else, Lord Marshal, it wouldn't last through a prolonged battle, it's far from practical in most combat scenarios. Roland made sure to sprinkle some truths among his lies. While the current operational time was around 10 to 15 minutes, he knew this issue could be fixed. It was also possible to create a lesser version using inferior alloys, allowing the suits to perform at the level of a higher-tiered Tier 2 class holder. There were many possibilities, but Roland couldn't reveal any of them. He could envision the Crown forcing him into a laboratory, churning out runic inventions until he died of old age if they discovered he had the capability to propel their military into a new age of runic machinery and weapons. An expensive toy, you say? How much? It seemed that his father was unconvinced and reluctant to back down, but upon hearing the price, which far exceeded the cost of equipping a knight commander, he was taken aback. That much? Yes, while the costs to construct one prototype are staggering already, it burns through magic fuel quickly. Regretfully, it's just not something that can be used out on a battlefield. Roland nodded, sensing that his father had finally given up on the issue. If he truly understood the full potential of the power armor, things would be different. Its strength didn't lie in making combatants equal to Tier 3 elites but in enabling those without combat classes to wield its power. Roland was confident that someone like Bernier could operate it and gain the abilities of a Tier 2 class holder without having a combat class. With enough time and effort, they could transform the non-combatants, who vastly outnumbered the class holders, into a large army. I understand, that is truly a disappointment. Professor, if you ever finish your work, please find me or one of my men. Of course, Lord Marshal, if I make a breakthrough, I'll make sure that my work benefits the kingdom. Just as he finished his sentence, one of the knights approached Wentworth and whispered something in his ear. The Marshal nodded and quickly relayed the information. It seemed that Wentworth's visit was finally coming to an end. The contracts have been signed. As per my agreement with the Count, my men and I shall now take our leave. I have instructed my men to escort you and your students to the next city. I trust you will not mind if I reclaim my daughter from your care. The entire place was now abuzz as people were allowed to leave the estate. While he wasn't sure what would become of Robert and Lucienne, his involvement ended here. A bitter aftertaste lingered in his mouth, reminding him that he was nothing more than an outsider. What he needed to do now was return to the nearest teleportation gate, get back to the institute, and then go home so his life could continue. Although everything seemed to have worked out in the end, he couldn't shake off the lingering bitterness of how it all ended. Of course, Lord Marshal, I will leave her in your hands. Roland stood there as Wentworth made his way toward some of his soldiers. Lucienne, accompanied by her 3 friends, soon arrived, guarded by his men. Arian, who had slipped into the arena during the duel, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Roland's scanners indicated he had made it outside the estate. Even if Arian were captured, Wentworth would likely allow him to leave without signing a contract, just as he had done for Roland. It was clear Wentworth had no desire to provoke any issues with Yavanna and saw both Roland and anyone from the Institute as allies. His sister didn't seem cheerful even though her brother was now free. She and the other girls probably saw this whole situation as unfair but were too afraid to voice their opinions in front of the overbearing Marshal. Her face was somber, eyes downcast, burdened by the weight of familial duty and the fate awaiting her brother. Roland couldn't help but feel pity for her. Lucienne, like Robert, was caught in the merciless grip of noble expectations, and there seemed to be no escape for either of them. Wentworth, though calm and collected, was like a force of nature, unyielding, pragmatic, and driven by his own rigid sense of duty. During their conversation, he had shown a different side, but now his mask was firmly back in place. There had been a fleeting warmth during their discussions, but which was his true face? And what was his true goal? Was he acting to protect his family from harm, or was he simply trying to preserve his house's honor? The answer remained elusive and he wasn't sure if he would ever unearth it. Lucienne, standing quietly with her friends, remained silent as Wentworth approached. Her downcast expression betrayed an inner turmoil that Roland could only guess at. He had always seen her as the bright, headstrong girl, but in front of her father, she seemed more like a subdued, obedient puppy. Thankfully, her mother wasn't far off. After a brief conversation with Wentworth, Lucienne was allowed to separate from the group without much protest from Margaret. "Professor, what will happen to Lucy? Can't we go with her?" Margaret, Adesuna, and Marline looked up at him with pleading eyes after they were allowed to pass. Roland was relieved that Margaret, usually the ringleader, hadn't caused a large scene, or at least wasn't causing one now. He'd heard her complaining while being led out of the arena, but even she seemed to understand there was little to be done when her friends' parents were involved. It was better to let them leave peacefully. She'll be fine, she is with her parents. But, what will happen with her? Will she get punished? Asked Adasuna, her wolven ears flattening in concern as her tail twitched nervously behind her. The other two girls nodded in agreement, their expressions mirroring her worry. Hadley the maid remained standing without any change to her expression as they all looked from afar as Lucienne and her parents went away while being escorted by many armored men. She will be fine, her parents won't harm her, you should start worrying about yourself, now let us depart, we have to return to the institute. Roland sighed softly, still having to contend with this small group of children. The knights assigned to escort them approached, ready to lead them away. The journey back would take some time, but afterward, he would finally be free of his duties as a babysitter. His sister, Lucienne, would likely be fine, but whether she would be allowed to attend the institute again was another matter. The Viola incident, coupled with this debacle involving Robert, might just push Wentworth to consider homeschooling as a more controlled alternative. I guess this is it, but what's with this feeling? Roland watched as Lucienne, her shoulders slumped and her steps slow, was led away by her parents and the armored knights. The sight left him feeling conflicted. It wasn't his place to intervene further, and yet, he couldn't shake the sense that this was far from a happy ending. Neither his brother or sister could distance themselves from their overbearing father, but at least they were now safe. Professor, what if we never see her again? Margaret's voice brought him back to the present. She stood with her arms crossed, her voice defiant as always. I'm sure you'll see her again, but she might take a small break from future classes. Now come, we must go. Roland assured, keeping his tone steady, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. The girls exchanged worried glances, clearly unconvinced. However, they didn't have much leeway to complain as their escorts urged them to move forward. Count Graham's soldiers were also quite unwelcoming and started pushing everyone outside the gates. The pleasantries were now done and everyone was forced to leave. Once outside the gates, Roland took a final glance at his display. His deactivated golems remained buried in several locations, hidden beneath the surface. Most of his flying devices had already returned to the temporary workshop where Bernier would retrieve them, but he chose to let a few remain in place. Though it posed a safety risk and could lead to trouble later, Roland had a lingering feeling they might prove useful in the future. It wasn't the most cautious decision, but his instincts told him to leave them for now, just in case. Eventually, the group arrived at the workshop, where they were greeted by the workers and Arian. Everyone was already busy packing up and preparing for their return. The dwarves skillfully dismantled the temporary setup, their thick hands quickly unhooking components and placing them into crates. The air buzzed with the familiar scent of metal and oil, a reminder of the countless hours Roland had spent tinkering with the power armor here. It was finally time to leave and put this journey behind him, but he hesitated. Strange thoughts crept into his mind as he contemplated a crazy idea, one that had some merits but would put him and the people around him in danger. The sound of wheels spinning was only interrupted by the horses trotting. Inside the carriage, 5 people sat, with Roland contemplating the future as he glanced out the window. He was on his way back to the teleportation gate, accompanied by students from the institute. This wasn't the entire group. Bernier, the craftsman, and even Arian followed behind in 2 other carriages. Surrounding them was a group of 10 knights, sent by Wentworth Arden, who had ordered them to escort the party back. Armand and Lobelia, on the other hand, weren't with them. They had been considered too problematic to bring along on the trip, and Roland eventually relented. The two weren't too upset about taking the long way back, as they had been cooped up on the island for far too long. As newly minted Tier 3 class holders, they were eager to tour the kingdom, experiencing it as true elites and enjoying some adventure. With countless dungeons and cities to explore, they likely wouldn't return to Albrook for several weeks. Faster if Roland decided that they needed to return, and with the use of teleportation gates, this was not an issue anymore. The tension of the last few days had taken its toll on all of them, and the reality of returning to the institute loomed over his head. Roland's thoughts drifted between concern for his siblings and the nagging feeling of unfinished business. The power armor, Wentworth's strong-handed approach, and the politics surrounding the Arden family left him with more questions than answers. I might not get to see either of them, but, what am I supposed to do? Roland's mind raced as the carriage swayed gently beneath him. The rhythmic clatter of hooves provided a steady backdrop to his swirling thoughts. The Arden family's affairs weighed heavily on him, particularly the fate of his brother. Even though the two hadn't interacted much, young Robert had grown on him. As someone from a more modern world, Roland disagreed with the fate that had befallen Robert and his lover. However, this was the safest route back, and rocking the boat now could potentially destroy everything he had hoped to protect. I should just go home. His thoughts shifted to Albrook, the place he called home. His wife, Elydia, was waiting for him there. Although they had managed to stay in touch through magical tools, he still longed for her presence. His work wasn't over yet. The city he was building needed his attention. This was supposed to be nothing more than a side mission. Robert was saved, Lucienne was back home, and everything had worked out in the end. There was no reason for him to do anything more. So, he tried to suppress those bitter feelings as the journey home continued. The carriage hit a small bump, jolting him from his thoughts. Margaret and the others glanced over, still lost in their own reflections. Despite their concern for Lucienne, they seemed to trust his words from earlier. The long, peaceful road stretched ahead and hours continued to pass. With the knights protecting them, no bandits decided to impede their journey and they arrived at their destination before sundown. The city of Antolun was before them and once inside they just needed to use the teleportation gate to return to the institute. The group's arrival at Antolun was met with the usual bustle of city life. Market stalls lined the streets, the chatter of merchants and travelers filling the air. Getting through the gate was rather easy and they were welcomed by the guards with a lot of decorum. Did Wentworth arrange this? I suppose this will make things a lot faster. It quickly became clear that he wouldn't need to wait in line. Another group of soldiers awaited them inside the city, ready to escort them to the Mage Tower where the teleportation gate was located. Perhaps this was the old man's way of thanking him, or simply a means of keeping a close watch on the mage who had involved himself with his family. Roland followed the knights through the bustling streets of Antolun, drawing glances from both citizens and guards. He was certain that the Count's influence remained strong in the city and that his movements were being closely monitored. However, it wasn't until they arrived at the Lorien Mage Tower that he noticed a change. Although the tower maintained a partnership with Count Graham, the mages had a tendency to stick together. Once inside, the guards and knights who had accompanied them were not permitted to enter. "Thank you for your hard work. Please send my regards to the Lord Marshal." The knight commander who came with him nodded. Finally, he took his leave and took his troops with him. Roland finally exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The towering stone walls of the Lorien Mage Tower offered a strange sense of sanctuary and allowed him to clear his mind. Here, magic reigned supreme and the familiar environment even brought a certain level of comfort to the three young girls that were with him. "My parents are probably worried, I'm sure Lucy will be fine with theirs." "You're probably right, Marline, there is no use for us to worry." Margaret seemed the most distant, as if her mind was occupied by numerous thoughts. She remained silent for most of the trip, a stark contrast to how she had been when Roland's sister was with them. To Roland, it appeared that Margaret didn't hold these two girls in the same regard as she did Lucienne, though he wondered if he was overanalyzing the situation. After all, their friend had been taken away and was possibly facing punishment, so it was natural for them all to be feeling down. "Everyone, let's go. Once you're back at the institute, please resume your classes. Your classmate Lucienne will likely return later." Inside, the vast atrium of the Mage Tower was bustling with robed figures, scholars, and arcane researchers, all engrossed in their various pursuits. They were part of the Mage Guild and took on various quests for money, something that some of the graduates from the institute would end up doing in the future. The teleportation gate sat in a separate chamber on an elevated floor. Once they arrived there, the portal shimmered into life as their arrival had been pre-arranged. "I didn't get much time to look around last time, but I definitely prefer our workshop to this Mage Tower." Roland and the students from the institute weren't the only ones there. Bernier, Arian, and the craftsmen had come along as well. They, too, were from the institute and would be returning with the group. "Just don't touch anything, and keep your voice down. Some mages might take offense," Roland cautioned. "Ah, sure, boss." Bernier replied with a grin and moved to the side. Roland led the students and everyone else toward the platform, the familiar hum of magical energy reverberating through the room. The same grey-hair mage as before was there to greet them. He just nodded at Roland when he saw them, not really taking any time to make sure he wasn't using the gate for anything nefarious. His mana signature was the same and he had the Institute's emblem with him, and this was enough to be trusted by the mages working here. "The gate is ready for you, safe travels." The man gave them a few words before they approached the gate, and this time, Roland insisted that the four go through first. He needed to ensure they went through and didn't try anything reckless, like staying behind to contact Lucienne. For a moment, he thought Margaret might try to argue, but to his surprise, she was the first to step through, followed by her maid. The two other girls followed shortly after, and soon the rest of the group began filing through as well. Well, I'll be heading ahead. This trip was fascinating, but I need some shut-eye. Arian said, yawning, and one of the dwarves nodded. Arian was the next to pass through, followed by the dwarven craftsman. They had worked tirelessly for days on the power armor and were in dire need of rest. The journey here had been rough, while some had managed to sleep a bit, others looked exhausted and pale. Is something wrong, boss? Wrong? No, everything is fine. Are you sure? You've been spacing out a lot more than usual and that could mean only one thing. Bernier was quick to realize that Roland wasn't feeling great. His perceptiveness never failed to surprise Roland, but he couldn't let his worries slip through the cracks. I'm just tired, Bernier. Like you said, this trip has been long and complicated. Bernier tilted his head, clearly not satisfied with the vague answer, but he nodded anyway. Well, if you say so, boss. Just remember, I'm with you, heck, we all are. Whatever you decide, no one's going to fault you for it. I'm not sure what you are getting at. Ha, don't worry about it. But it might be best if you give the missus a call before you do anything else. Bernier teased with a wink before stepping through the teleportation gate. His words lingered in his mind, and the hesitation to step through the teleporter grew stronger. The grey-haired mage glanced at him with concern as the magical energies continued to drain, longer than necessary. Aren't you going? If not, you'll have to wait until morning to travel again. My apologies. I think I'll take the one in the morning. The mage looked confused but nodded. The teleportation gate shimmered for a moment before losing its form and shutting down. Roland stood there, staring at the now deactivated teleportation gate, feeling the weight of his decision. His companions had already passed through, returning to the safety of the institute, but something inside him had made him hesitate. He knew the reason why he had stopped, but the rational part in his brain was still trying to make him reconsider. If I wait too long, I might not get the chance. Once Robert gets to the estate, it will be much harder. I can still catch up to him and also to her, but we have a waiting room nearby, friend, if you'd like to think things over. The grey-haired mage suggested, giving him a long, curious look before pointing toward a guest room. It wasn't unusual for mages to pause and contemplate deep matters. The tower encouraged such reflection, even providing special rooms for uninterrupted thought. Roland nodded at the suggestion and quietly left the teleportation chamber, heading to one of these rooms, which featured a balcony. There, he paused to ponder his situation more deeply. Bernier's words echoed in his mind, and he decided to follow the advice. If he was about to do something dangerous, his wife deserved to know. He moved over to the balcony and activated the long-range communication feature inside of his helmet and waited patiently for his wife to respond to his call. As Roland waited for the connection to stabilize, his eyes scanned the surroundings. He was in the middle of the tower and from this balcony could see some of the soldiers that had followed him from Count Graham's estate. Most of them were in the process of retreating, but some still were hiding out and keeping a lookout on the tower. He was sure that Graham had ordered them to remain there for longer and make sure that he didn't just wander out into the city to cause more trouble in his lands. Roland? Is that you? Elydia's voice crackled through the device, and the moment Roland heard her, his worries seemed to melt away. On the small panel inside his helmet, her face appeared, concern in her eyes, but with that familiar, comforting smile. Yes, it's me. Sorry for calling so late. Are you doing all right? He asked, trying to buy himself some time as he gathered his thoughts, unsure of how to ask for permission for what he was about to do. I'm fine. I've closed down the shop and we had a small explosion in that alchemy lab, but everyone is fine. She replied, and her brow furrowed slightly. But you sound different. What's going on? Did something happen? I guess you can read me like a book. I would like to hear your opinion on this. Roland took a deep breath, leaning against the stone railing of the balcony. The day had ended and the sun had already set. While it wasn't quite dark yet, the air was quite cool and the stars were starting to show themselves. He stared out over the city of Antolun. The distant glow of the lanterns being turned on made him somewhat relax as he started explaining to Elydia. First, you probably know about my brother and how all of this started. Yes, go on. Elydia nodded and sat down in front of her own communication device, listening intently as Roland explained how Robert had successfully won his duel and earned his freedom. But not everything had gone as hoped. Robert had been quickly apprehended by his father, and his lover remained imprisoned in a tower, locked away, doomed never to meet him again in this life. "I see, so what's holding you back?" she asked, her voice strangely calm, which took Roland by surprise. "Hey? What do you mean? You're not against it?" "I probably should, shouldn't I? I suppose I got used to my husband's antics." Elydia replied again, her voice was laced with some worry, but she seemed to have some confidence. "Roland, I wouldn't have married someone who turns their back on family. Robert is your brother, isn't he? You're capable of saving him, aren't you? I know you've thought this through in that big head of yours, and are worried about bringing more trouble into our lives if you do this, right? So don't worry. If something happens, we'll tackle that problem together as a family. Now stop moping around and go help your brother." "Yes, ma'am." Elydia smiled brightly at him, and in the background, he could hear a certain wolf barking from a distance. He was surprised by her reaction. He knew she was still worried, but now that they had discussed it, he was determined to give it his all. Agni's barks only made him want to return home faster, but first, he needed to finish what he had started. "Just don't take long. I'll make your favorite stew. I suppose I'll have to make more than usual. Yeah, we'll be having 2 more guests." "Great, don't take too long and be careful." "I will. See you soon and I love you." "I love you tw, Ak." Agni, stop trying to squeeze through the window. Bad wolf." Just as they were about to have a moment, he heard a commotion from Elydia's side. The connection momentarily wavered, and Roland chuckled as he imagined Agni's antics disrupting their conversation. He felt like a weight dropped from his shoulder, and now he knew what he had to do. "I'll hurry back, I promise." With the conversation drawing to a close, he took a deep breath and focused on the task ahead. After ending the call, he stepped away from the balcony to make some space and avoid detection from the soldiers down on the ground. Once out of sight, he took out one of his new creations, the runic glider. "I can finally use this. No one saw it before, so they won't be able to pin it on me. Robert's location is there, can I get them both before the teleportation gate is free again?" He pondered the question while making some adjustments to his appearance. Although he was wearing full body armor, showing up in the institute robe would be a foolish idea. Even if someone recognized him, they would need proof. So, he pulled out a previously prepared attachment for his helmet that fit perfectly, giving him the appearance of a very common monster. He removed his robe and replaced it with one tinted dark green, and his glider shifted to match the new color. Once everything was in place, he set the glider down near the balcony and glanced outside. There didn't seem to be anyone nearby, but the soldiers remained vigilant. He took a moment to steady his breath, feeling the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. The stakes were high, but he had made up his mind. He could not leave Robert to his fate, especially when there was still a chance to make things right. With one last look over the edge of the balcony, he activated the glider, and it sprang to life. The runic symbols glowed softly on the metallic surface of his flying creation. Once active, he took his first step forward, his feet magnetizing to the surface, allowing him to stand on the glider as it hovered gently in the air. A dense fog erupted from beneath the glider, surrounding his form, and he slowly propelled himself into the night sky, heading toward the convoy that held his brother hostage. A long carriage moved through the early night, surrounded by nearly 30 soldiers. All of them were on high alert, their eyes scanning the dark forest edges as they moved steadily through the quiet roads. The moonlight cast long shadows over the trees, creating an eerie atmosphere. The soldiers guarding the convoy were hardened men, veterans who had seen countless battles, and they would complete the mission their leader had tasked them with. "Hey, stop this, let me out. Please calm down, don't make this difficult on us, we are just following the Lord Marshal's orders." From inside the heavily reinforced carriage, Robert Arden's voice carried outside. It was accompanied by the ringing of shackles as he struggled against his restraints. His frustration echoed within the confined space, though his captors remained unmoved. The soldiers were loyal to Wentworth Arden, their expressions impassive as they rode horses alongside the carriage, determined to carry out their duty without question. "Let me out, I'll never forget this. I'll remember all of your faces and names. Please calm down, you'll just make things worse for yourself, young lord." The forest loomed around them, the only sounds being the steady clop of horse hooves and the occasional rustling of leaves. Despite Robert's pleas and threats, none of the guards besides their commander dared to respond. They had their orders, and nothing would break their discipline, not even the protests of their lord's son. The carriage was built like a fortress on wheels, reinforced with iron plating to withstand attacks, but the soldiers remained cautious. After the deal with the Count was made, they were not expecting any direct assault, but in times of political unrest, they needed to stay vigilant. Shit! Robert pulled at the chains, his wrists raw and bruised from hours of futile effort. No matter how hard he tried, the chains wouldn't budge. His hopes of reuniting with Lucille, his love, were slipping away, becoming nothing more than a distant dream. Deep down, he knew it was pointless to struggle. Even though he had won the duel and his father had intervened, the deal was made. He longed to see her again, but doubt gnawed at him. Was he doing the right thing? Could he even offer Lucille a better life? Even if he managed to break free and escape the guards, what then? How could he possibly get to Lucille, let alone get her out of the mansion? The Grand Knight Commander would hunt him down, and that would be the end. His father's deal wouldn't protect him from the Count's soldiers and their blades. They would likely kill him on sight, and his father would be powerless to stop it. Is this it? Should I just give up? Robert mumbled to himself as he gazed through one of the tiny slits in the carriage. The slits, barely large enough to see through, were designed only to let air in. The interior was barren, purposefully built to contain Tier 3 class holders. For him a Tier 2 this was more than enough. There was no escape. The metal restraining him felt familiar, similar to the alloy used in the power armor he recently wore, and he wished he had it now. Thinking of the armor brought his brother, Roland, to mind. Their father had knocked Robert out before the two of them began their conversation, leaving him in the dark about what had happened afterward. Asking the soldiers for information was out of the question, as he couldn't afford to blow Roland's cover. His brother had always been secretive, a person who preferred to keep to himself. Yet, whenever it mattered, he had been there for Robert. Memories of their childhood resurfaced, times when Robert used to pick on his younger brother, who only wanted to be left alone. A deep sense of shame settled over him as he recalled how he had treated Roland. He wondered if he was part of the reason his brother had fled the noble life. Robert couldn't blame him. Now, he too found himself caught in the web of a noble's deal, possibly facing a long imprisonment. Whatever deal his father had made with the Count, it likely ensured that Robert would never see Lucille again. That thought weighed heavily on him, and it was something he might have to accept. I should have just asked for help sooner, but now I have no room to complain. Slumping his shoulders, he began to wonder how different things might have been if he had turned to Roland for help from the start. His brother's magic and runes had proven far more powerful than he ever expected. Roland had created something that allowed Robert to win against a knight commander, one who had even been enhanced by illicit substances. With that kind of magical power, smuggling Lucille out of the mansion might have been easy. But instead, Robert had ruined it all. His recklessness had gotten them caught, and now he had to live with his choice. As the carriage trundled on, Robert sat in grim silence, his mind awash with regrets and self-pity. The rhythmic clattering of hooves became almost hypnotic, soothing him into a restless, half-conscious state. He had been so close, closer than he ever imagined to living a life with Lucille, but now, it all seemed distant, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. At first, his only goal had been to impress his father, to rise above his brothers, and to prove his worth. He tossed himself into many battles against enemy soldiers and monsters alike. But now, as he sat in chains, he realized how meaningless that ambition seemed compared to what he had lost. What would becoming a knight commander even matter if he was never to see Lucille again? However, just when Robert felt he had hit rock bottom, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, the horses faltered. He sensed the change immediately as the carriage began to slow down. Sitting up straighter, his instincts screamed that something was afoot. Peering through the familiar slit, he noticed a thick, smoky fog creeping in and enveloping the entire carriage. "Hold! Hold!" The commander's voice rang out sharply, and the carriage came to a grinding halt. Robert tried to peer through the narrow slits in the walls, but he couldn't make out what was happening. The chains holding him to the center of the prison carriage clinked as he shifted, and he could sense something was wrong. "Ambush!" One of the soldiers outside shouted before abruptly falling silent, leaving the outside world eerily muffled. A monster attack? Or did that bastard Graham decide to tie up loose ends? He muttered under his breath as the carriage shook violently. Something struck it hard, but he had no way of seeing what was happening. Robert knew Count Graham despised him, but he wasn't sure if the man had the nerve to break the deal he'd made with Robert's father. There were always ways to twist a written contract, though, and it was possible the Count had arranged this, an assassination disguised as an ambush. But the soldiers guarding him were some of his father's elite troops. They wouldn't go down easily. A silencing spell? Are they really here to kill me? It was a common trick used by skilled killers, removing all sound from the vicinity. Most fighters relied on their ears just as much as their eyes, and sudden silence left them disoriented. Robert, however, could still sense the vibrations through the tight chains binding him. He felt the tremors from outside. It seemed that one by one, the soldiers and their horses were collapsing to the ground. Even the heavy carriage quivered from time to time. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. Silence engulfed him and it seemed the battle was over. Is it over? His voice, previously muted by some kind of spell or ability, returned. But now, he could hear something else, a strange, faint humming sound growing closer. The carriage he was trapped in was no ordinary vehicle. It had been specially designed, with a mechanism that prevented it from being opened until it reached its destination. The soldiers outside didn't have any keys, and the door could only be unlocked under very specific conditions. It was built to ensure that no one could escape, and more importantly, no one could get inside. Even if someone managed to steal the carriage, freeing its prisoner would be a tedious and difficult task. A magical pulse had likely already been triggered, alerting nearby troops to the disturbance. Reinforcements were probably on their way, but whether they'd arrived in time was uncertain. Tzzzzzz. Out of nowhere, a red dot appeared above him, quickly growing in size. Suddenly, a searing ray of heat erupted at his side. Something had melted through the thick outer shell of the carriage's ceiling and was now moving in a slow, deliberate circle. It continued its motion, steadily burning through the reinforced plating while Robert was forced to sit and wait, helpless. At first, he assumed it was the work of a powerful mage, using advanced fire or heat magic to breach the armored carriage. But as he watched, he realized this wasn't raw, chaotic magic. There was a precision to it, as if someone were carving a perfect circle with a tool rather than using a wild spell meant to kill. This wasn't the work of an assassin intent on destruction. Whoever was behind this wasn't trying to harm the prisoner inside, they were being careful not to. Soon, the metal overhead groaned as a circular section of the roof came loose. But instead of crashing down into the carriage, it floated upward, then was tossed aside by whoever had cut it. Robert looked up to see a strange hooded figure, their face hidden behind a mask that resembled a goblin. The figure said nothing but reached out with a metallic hand. The moment they did, glowing magical symbols appeared on the shackles binding Robert's wrists and ankles. The symbols shifted, glowing brighter until a loud click echoed through the carriage and suddenly, he was free. If you could do this, why didn't you just open the door? Robert rubbed his now free wrists, fully aware of who the person above him was, though he couldn't understand why he had come back for him. His savior appeared a bit annoyed by his question, and as they answered, a ladder made of black rope and metallic steps was lowered. I had my reasons, just grab the ladder. He didn't hesitate and grabbed onto the lowered ladder. The person outside leaned back for a moment, allowing a strange contraption to come into view. It was dark outside, making it hard to see, but it resembled a winged bird made of metal. The rope ladder he clung to was connected to its underside, and once he had a firm grip, the contraption began to lift them into the air. The man with the goblin mask stood atop this strange floating device, which somehow pulled them both upward. As Robert passed through the circular opening, he could see all the soldiers who had been guarding him sprawled on the ground. Some were lightly injured, and there were holes in the earth indicating that explosions had occurred. Remarkably, no one appeared to be dead, instead, they seemed to be in a deep slumber, covered by a strange, mist-like substance, most likely a type of sleeping gas. Robert felt a chill wash over his body as he was hit by the cool night breeze. His armor and thicker clothing were taken away from him, replaced by simple pants and a linen shirt that didn't protect him too well against the elements. Even so, the night air felt invigorating against his skin, a stark contrast to the oppressive confines of the carriage. He knew that the masked man was his brother. He wished to ask him about why he was here, but before he could, he called out to him instead. Hold on tight, this isn't over yet. It's not over. No, we still have one more person to rescue, don't we? As the metallic contraption soared above the treetops, Robert's heart raced. He had wanted to rescue his lover for the longest time but had given up all hope. Now his brother appeared to reignite that burning desire. Wait, you mean Lucille? Who else? Now shut up or you might bite your tongue or eat some bugs. His savior offered little explanation before the flying contraption began to glow. Suddenly, bright orange magic erupted from one side, propelling it into the night sky. The ladder he was gripping jolted back as they shot through the air faster than Robert had ever experienced before. The wind howled in Robert's ears as the glider sped through the night, slicing through the air with incredible speed. He clung tightly to the ladder, the cold metal steps biting into his palms, but the rush of adrenaline kept him focused. The forest blurred beneath them, and soon, the dense tree line gave way to a clear road, one leading to the city and estate that Lucille was in. He wished to ask his brother why he was doing this. Why would he do something this stupid to help someone as irresponsible as him? Roland, perched on the glider, stayed silent, his goblin-like mask hiding his expression. Instead of complaining, he just nodded. If someone could help, then it was him, and for this aid, he would be forever grateful. I got him out. It should take them at least an hour to get to that carriage, but that doesn't mean that I won't have more time. Roland zoomed through the air on his glider while his brother held onto the ladder below it for his dear life. While he wasn't as fast as a modern jet plane, he could infuse enough mana to get close to the speed of an older model plane with a speed up to 500 km per hour. Robert's inclusion slowed him down slightly, but it was still fine. He had a reason for taking his time to open the wagon from the top and leaving most of the people inside unharmed. If he had tried to enter through the reinforced door, it would have triggered a signal, alerting those outside that something was wrong. The same would have happened if he had simply killed the soldiers, who were equipped with special devices that monitored their vital signs and in some cases, even their souls. When it came to airborne creations, the world was still in its early stages of development. Small aircraft like this glider were unheard of, and only large airships were considered viable for air travel. Roland's main concern wasn't a rival aircraft, but flying beasts like wyverns, which people had tamed and used for airborne combat. Although their top speed was slower than what his glider could achieve, he wasn't eager to test his creation while carrying 2 passengers. As Roland and Robert raced through the night, Roland's mind was already calculating his next move. The rescue mission wasn't over yet. Getting Robert out had been the easy part, now came the real challenge, freeing Lucille from the heavily fortified estate of Count Graham. The city glowed with lantern light in the distance, but Roland took a detour, steering around it as he made his way toward Count Graham's estate. He wasn't sure what to expect, but for now, their approach remained undetected. Some of his golems, previously deactivated, sprang back to life as he re-established his map. Dots representing key figures like the Count, his daughter, and the Grand Knight Commander appeared on the display, and for the moment, Roland had the upper hand. His pace began to slow as he approached the magical barrier surrounding the estate. Though his enemies seemed unaware of his presence, that didn't mean their defenses were weak. The mages who had arrived for the duel were still on site, and some of them weren't sleeping. If he didn't play his cards right, even a single spell could reveal their positions. He would need to approach the situation with precision and strategy. "Robert, can you hear me?" "Why yeah." His brother wasn't too used to the fast and turbulent flight, but he managed to gather himself and respond. "This is the point of no return, so before we go in I need to ask you, do you want me to take Lucille with us? I'm sure you know what this will mean for the both of you, right?" Roland had talked to both of them before and somewhat knew the answer to this question, but he still needed to make sure. If they entered the estate grounds and rescued Lucille, they would be crossing a line, something that they wouldn't be able to come back from. Robert took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the ladder as Roland's words sank in. This was it, the point of no return. If they went through with this plan, if they rescued Lucille, it would mean defying his father, Count Graham, and possibly the entire noble class. The consequences would be severe, and there would be no turning back. His life would be forever changed. "Yes, I know, and still. I see, that's all I needed to hear, but before we go in, I think you might need a change of clothes."